Janine Hayward never imagined the man she married. Detective Mark Hayward, a decorated officer and father of their only child, was hiding a monstrous secret behind his badge. But one ordinary Thursday night, she opened her 12-year-old daughter's bedroom door and uncovered a scene so horrifying, it changed everything in a single breath. What followed wasn't just a shooting. It was a mother's irreversible decision, a community's shattered illusion, and a courtroom battle that left the nation asking, when justice fails, how far will a mother go to protect her child? The Haywards lived at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Mesa, Arizona. The kind of neighborhood where American flags hung outside freshly painted homes, sprinklers ticked to life at sunrise, and families gathered in driveways on weekends for barbecues. Their house, a beige two-story with white trim and a manicured lawn, blended in perfectly. It was the kind of place you'd pass without a second thought. But if you looked closely, if you really paid attention, you might have noticed something just a bit off. Detective Mark Hayward was a decorated officer with the Mesa Police Department. With nearly 20 years on the force, he had a reputation for being reliable, level-headed, and fiercely protective of the vulnerable. Colleagues respected him, especially for his work in crimes against children. It was the kind of irony no one would recognize until it was far too late. He walked the halls of the department with quiet confidence. No scandals, no complaints. A model cop. At home, he was seen as a loving husband and devoted father to their only child, 12-year-old Ellie. Janine Hayward played the role of supportive wife with practiced ease. She rarely missed a church service, homeschooled Ellie diligently, and kept the house spotless. To those who knew her casually, Janine was kind but distant, polite but guarded, always smiling but never quite reaching the eyes. She once told a neighbor that she didn't let Ellie watch TV or use the internet because the world was too dangerous. The neighbor had nodded in agreement, not realizing just how prophetic that comment would one day become. Ellie Hayward, on the other hand, was more of a mystery. Pale and quiet, she was rarely seen outside. When she did venture out, usually by her mother's side, she clutched her backpack like a lifeline and avoided eye contact. Other children in the neighborhood had playdates and sleepovers. Ellie didn't. Her parents said she was shy and introspective, but as the months went by, some people began to wonder if there was more to it than that. Why did she always wear long sleeves, even in the summer? Why did she flinch when someone reached toward her suddenly? Why did she never smile in photographs? None of those questions had answers. Not yet. Inside the Hayward home, silence was the dominant language. Dinner conversations were limited to yes or no questions. Laughter was almost never heard. Ellie spent most of her time in her bedroom. Mark worked long hours and often kept odd shifts. Janine maintained a rigid routine, moving from room to room like a ghost, dusting surfaces that were already clean, making meals that went untouched. There were cracks forming. Tiny ones, but easy to ignore if you weren't looking directly at them. One evening, Janine noticed Ellie's door was locked. That had never happened before. She asked Mark about it, and he dismissed her concern with a laugh, saying Ellie was just learning boundaries. Another time, she found the family laptop missing from its usual place. Mark said he'd taken it to work. That didn't make sense. He never brought work home. But Janine didn't press. She told herself she was overthinking things. He didn't want to believe the feeling that had begun to grow inside her, a cold, leaden weight that made her chest tighten when she watched Mark brush Ellie's hair, or when she heard the faint sound of a doorknob turning in the middle of the night. She tried to rationalize it, tried to smother it with logic. Mark was her husband, a police officer. He'd sworn an oath. He had saved people. Protected them. Surely she was being paranoid, but still, she began writing things down, quietly, carefully. Just small details at first, dates, times, feelings, a journal hidden beneath the floorboards in the guest room closet. Each entry was a whisper, from a part of her that no longer trusted what she saw. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and although she didn't yet know what, she felt it pressing at the edges of her sanity, waiting to reveal itself. She just never imagined how horrifying the truth would turn out to be. It was a Thursday evening when everything began to unravel. Janine Hayward had just finished a late church group meeting that ran longer than usual. Normally, she'd stay back and chat with the other women, maybe help clean up or organize the hymnal, but that night, something compelled her to leave early. There was no real reason, just an unshakable feeling, a tightness in her chest that made her glance at the clock and decide, almost instinctively, that she needed to go home. She drove through the dark, quiet streets of their neighborhood, her headlights slicing through the stillness. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed that the front porch light, which Mark always turned on at dusk, was still off. Strange, but not alarming. She stepped inside, kicking off her shoes as the door closed behind her with a soft click. The house was silent, unnaturally so. No television, no footsteps, no hum of conversation. Janine assumed Ellie would already be in bed. Her daughter was usually asleep by 9, like clockwork. Mark had the evening off, but he wasn't in the living room. The couch was empty, the television cold and dark. A half-empty glass of water sat on the kitchen counter, condensation pooling beneath it. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, pressing in from all directions. As she moved through the house, a sound made her stop, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard above her, directly above, near Ellie's room. Then, just as quickly, silence again. She stood still, straining to hear. Her pulse quickened. Mark had said he was going to catch up on some reading tonight. Janine assumed he'd be in their bedroom. But something about that creak didn't feel right. Something about the quiet that followed. She started up the stairs, slowly, trying not to let her imagination run wild. But with every step, a chill crept deeper into her bones. When she reached the top, the hallway was dim. Only a sliver of light spilled from under Ellie's door. That's when her breath caught. Ellie's door was never closed all the way, not unless she was upset. But this time, it was shut, and a thin beam of warm yellow light leaked out beneath it. Janine stood there, her hand hovering just inches from the doorknob, listening. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Then something soft, barely audible. A shuffle. Fabric. The kind of sound that made her gut twist. He pressed her hand to the door. It wasn't locked. Her fingers curled around the handle, and slowly she turned it. The door opened without a sound. What she saw next shattered her. For a moment, her brain refused to process the image. It was too monstrous, too foreign to be real. The man she had married, the man who wore a badge and carried a gun, stood in front of her, too close to their daughter, far too close. Ellie's face was pale, frozen. Her eyes met her mother's, and something passed between them that was more powerful than words. Mark didn't move. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. The room, once a safe haven filled with childhood books and pastel walls, had been turned into something else. Something dark, something desecrated. Janine backed out of the room, her vision blurring. She stumbled down the stairs, every step feeling like it was taken underwater. Her mind screamed, but her mouth stayed shut. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She just moved with mechanical precision, her body overtaken by something primal. She walked to the hall closet. The safe was there, behind the coats. Mark had given her the code years ago. He thought it was a gesture of trust. He never expected she'd use it. The door opened with a beep. Inside, Mark's service weapon sat gleaming in its holster. Her hand didn't tremble as she picked it up. Janine turned and walked back up the stairs. Each footstep echoed like a drumbeat inside her skull. She was no longer the woman who cleaned the house and made dinner and homeschooled her child. She was something else now, something born of betrayal, rage, and unrelenting instinct, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. Janine stood outside Ellie's bedroom door, the weight of the gun in her hand feeling heavier with each passing second. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, but her mind was focused, clearer than it had ever been. She could still hear movement on the other side of the door, rustling, footsteps, maybe whispers. It didn't matter. Whatever was happening in that room had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She pushed the door open, slow and steady, just wide enough to see inside. Mark turned toward her immediately. His face changed. First confusion, then shock, then something else, something darker. But Janine didn't flinch. Her gaze passed right over him, straight to Ellie, who was sitting motionless on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face vacant. In that moment, time fractured. Janine didn't see a husband. She didn't see a man. She saw a predator. A man who had hidden in plain sight under the illusion of fatherhood, beneath the badge and uniform, behind the careful smiles and routine dinners. All those nights he'd told her he was working late. All those times Ellie looked away when he spoke to her. It had all been leading here. Janine raised the gun slowly, her arms steady despite the pounding in her chest. Mark stepped forward, hands half raised as if to speak, to explain, maybe even to manipulate her into believing her own eyes had lied. But she already knew. She had always known. Her body had screamed it long before her mind was willing to listen. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap. The recoil jolted her backward, but her grip didn't break. Mark staggered, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Blood bloomed across his shirt like a flower. The second shot came, fast, instinctual. His body collapsed, crumpling like a puppet with its strings cut. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, the only sound was the low whimper from the corner of the bed. Ellie hadn't screamed. She hadn't moved. Janine turned toward her slowly, carefully placing the gun on the carpet, as though it might go off again if she let it go too quickly. She took a single step toward her daughter, but Ellie recoiled, not from fear, but confusion, as if she didn't quite understand what had just happened, as if the idea of rescue was a foreign language she'd never learned to speak. Janine dropped to her knees and reached out, not to touch, just to be near. Tears welled in her eyes for the first time, but her voice wouldn't come. There was nothing to say, no words that could erase what had been done or what she had just done in response. She stayed there for what felt like hours, watching Ellie rock slightly back and forth, her gaze fixed on the body lying on the floor. Downstairs, a neighbor dialed 90800 after hearing what sounded like gunshots. Police cars arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights painted the walls of the Hayward house like a crime scene out of a television drama. Officers moved in, guns drawn, not knowing what they were about to walk into. They found Janine sitting in the hallway outside the bedroom, the weapon at her side, blood smeared across her hands and dress. She didn't resist when they placed her in handcuffs. She didn't speak when they asked what happened. She only glanced toward the bedroom door, then down at her hands. She was still whispering something under her breath when they led her outside into the glare of the patrol car lights. A quiet phrase, over and over. She's safe now, she's safe now, she's safe now. The nation watched as the headlines broke. Detective found dead in family home. Wife in custody after fatal shooting. The media exploded with speculation. Was it a domestic dispute? A jealous rage, a mother gone mad? News vans crowded the quiet cul-de-sac by sunrise. Neighbors watched in disbelief as officers taped off the Hayward home and carried out evidence in plastic bags. What no one knew yet, what the cameras hadn't captured, was the true horror hidden behind those walls. The initial reports framed Janine Hayward as the aggressor. She had shot her husband in their daughter's bedroom. Some outlets suggested she might have harmed the girl as well. But in the hours that followed, detectives on scene began to piece together a narrative far more disturbing than any of them had expected. When Ellie was taken into protective custody, she was nearly catatonic. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. A trauma counselor was brought in, and over the next 48 hours, fragments of the truth began to emerge. slowly, painfully, through drawings, gestures, and single words that sent chills down everyone's spine. Ellie hadn't just been neglected or mistreated. She had been living in a nightmare. Investigators combed through the house from top to bottom. In Mark Hayward's locked garage cabinet, they found encrypted hard drives, dozens of labeled USBs, and a hidden camera system wired into Ellie's room. Some of the devices were disguised as ordinary household items. There were timestamps, footage, digital logs. Years of it. He had been recording her for nearly 5 years, documenting every interaction, every violation, in precise, calculated order. The detail was horrifying. Worse still, it appeared Mark had kept a second phone, one Janine never knew existed. On it were messages, some sent, others drafted but never delivered. Messages to anonymous users, forums, exchanges of footage, evidence that Mark wasn't just documenting his crimes, he was sharing them. No one at the Mesa Police Department had suspected him, not once. He had been regarded as a pillar of the unit, particularly in cases involving children. His knowledge of procedures, his calm demeanor, and his ability to read predators now took on a sinister meaning. He had built his career around hiding in plain sight, and he had done it flawlessly. Janine's journal, found beneath a loose floorboard in the guest room closet, was turned over to detectives. Page after page detailed her growing suspicions. She had documented her unease with chilling precision. The strange sounds at night, the locked doors, Ellie's sudden changes in behavior, the empty laptop bag, the unexplained bruises. But there had been no concrete proof. Until the moment she walked in on him, she had written the words, "If I'm wrong, I'll live with the shame, but if I'm right and I do nothing, I'll never forgive myself." The district attorney's office immediately halted any standard murder charge. Instead, they launched a full investigation into the possibility that Janine Hayward had acted in a state of extreme psychological trauma, what some experts referred to as a dissociative fugue or maternal insanity. A panel of psychiatrists was brought in to evaluate her mental state during and after the shooting. Public sentiment began to shift. Janine was no longer a cold-blooded killer in the eyes of the media. She was a mother who had made an unthinkable discovery and acted in the only way she knew how. Still, some were hesitant. Could vigilantism ever be justified? Could killing someone, your own husband, a police officer, ever be excused? The law would have to answer that question. But for now, all anyone could do was look at the evidence and try to understand how such evil could have grown undetected for so long, inside a house so ordinary, on a street so quiet, and how one woman's horror became her breaking point. The courtroom was packed on the morning of Janine Hayward's arraignment. Every seat was taken, reporters lined the back wall, and cameras waited outside like vultures. But inside the sterile wood-paneled room, Janine sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. She wore no makeup. Her wedding ring had been removed. Across the room, the prosecution prepared its opening remarks, but the energy had shifted. This was no longer a simple murder trial. It had become something else. Something harder to categorize. The state's position was clear. Homicide had occurred. A police officer had been shot twice in the chest. His wife had done it. But their confidence wavered when the full scale of Mark Hayward's secret life came to light. The evidence was staggering. Dozens of terabytes of encrypted data recovered, a full forensics team confirming years of abuse, not just involving Ellie but possibly other unidentified minors. The courtroom recoiled when one investigator testified that Mark's files had included detailed logs of Ellie's daily routine, her sleep patterns, even her moments of distress. Pain cataloged like trophy. Janine never spoke during the proceedings. Her lawyers advised her not to. Instead, psychiatric experts testified on her behalf. One after another, they described a woman who had lived under psychological siege. Years of emotional conditioning, subtle gaslighting, and growing fear had worn her down until the truth exploded in her mind like a detonation. They said she wasn't mad. She was lucid, but pushed beyond the boundaries of reason. One doctor called it a controlled breakdown. Another described it as maternal trauma-induced response. The terminology didn't matter. The meaning was clear. When she pulled the trigger, Janine had believed it was the only way to save her child. The defense also submitted the handwritten journals. The entries were methodical, dated, and increasingly frantic. Jurors read Janine's words aloud in the deliberation room. "I think he's hurting her, but I can't prove it. She flinches when he walks past. She doesn't sleep. I hear her crying in her dreams." Each sentence carried the slow, creeping terror of a woman who suspected something but couldn't bear the thought of being right. Ellie, now under the care of a trauma specialist and a new foster placement, never returned to the courtroom. He was deemed too fragile. But her voice lived in a drawing admitted as evidence, a simple crayon sketch with a tall, dark figure standing over a small bed and a woman with wings shielding the child with her arms. It wasn't artistic, it was raw, painful, but it told the jury more than any testimony could. The trial lasted only 2 weeks. The verdict took less than 4 hours. Janine Hayward was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The judge ordered her to undergo long-term psychological treatment in a secure facility with regular evaluations. But she would not serve prison time. She would not be labeled a murderer, and in the eyes of many she had become something else entirely, an unwilling hero, a protector. Still, public opinion remained divided. Some hailed her as a mother who did what the system failed to do. Others warned that if personal justice became the standard, chaos would follow. But no matter the debate, one truth remained. Behind the beige siding and white trim of a normal-looking house, a darkness had grown unchecked. A predator had worn a badge, and the only person who had seen it, who had truly seen it, was the woman no one had listened to. Janine would spend the rest of her life trying to heal. Ellie, too. Their bond, though tested by fire, had survived. And though the scars would never fade, they had one thing that had once seemed impossible: freedom. But as the cameras turned away and the headlines faded, a question remained in the minds of those who followed the story closely. How many more Mark Haywards are still out there, hidden behind locked doors, guarded reputations, and blind trust?